Welcome to Parent Coaches Unleashed with Carrie and Jessica, where no topics are taboo or off limits. Join us as we let loose and discuss the real, raw feelings about parenting.
In each episode, we will bring you heartfelt discussions, real-life stories, and special guests that will both entertain you and encourage community so no one feels alone in their parenting journey.
Thanks so much for listening. Now let's start the show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first episode of 2025. Carrie and I have really been looking forward to sharing this episode with you. Today we have Jill Malashok and Jana Kohn with us, and we're so excited to have them with us. So welcome, Jill and Jana. I'm just going to start by having them give a brief description about themselves and what they do. Jill?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Malashok. I am a speech language pathologist that specializes in early intervention out of St. Louis. I am currently working on piloting a program at a university locally to support speech pathology graduate students in implementing early intervention services for individuals with autism spectrum disorders, with a huge focus on caregiver education. All of my work is through a neurodiverse-affirming lens and focuses on strengths-based learning to really empower families and their children to be the best advocates for themselves and lead independent, meaningful lives.
There is so much there we cannot wait to unpack. But first, Jana, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, yes. So I'm Jana Kohn. I'm also a speech language pathologist. I work in the Chicagoland area at a local high school in extended transition services. So I work with young adults with disabilities between the ages of 18 and 22 on primarily community-based services targeting executive functioning, social language, life and vocational skills, and disability awareness. And so our ultimate goal is to help post-secondary lives for young adults with disabilities.
Welcome. We're so happy to have you here. And Carrie and I always talk about our theme for our episodes being helping parents raise children to live the most independent, successful lives that they can. And the reason for having Jill and Jana on our show today is what happens when it doesn't look the same for all parents. What do they do and where do they go? So I'm going to turn it over to Carrie now because we wanted to talk about some of our prep work for this episode.
So Jill and Jana happen to know each other. They met in college, and Jill introduced me to Jana. And so we're so grateful that they're here today because they have a lot of information to share with parents who have children that are neurodivergent. And in prepping for our episode, Jill sent over a poem called Welcome to Holland, and it is by Emily Pearl Kingsley. And it's a very powerful message about expectations when you have a new baby and things are different and very different than what you expected, and what you do as a parent to shift your perspective, to educate yourself, and so forth. So I want to turn it over to Jill so she could share a little bit about the poem and why you thought that was an important poem for Jessica and I to read, but for us to share with our audience.
Absolutely. Well, in summary, Welcome to Holland really talks about, Carrie's exactly right, that kind of change in expectations. You have a baby, you get all the gear, you read all the books, you get as prepared as possible, and you expect everything to be a certain way. And so in this particular poem, it talks about getting ready to go to Italy and all that Italy will afford. And then when you finally land and arrive, you are actually in Holland. And you don't know where you are or how you got there, and you're not prepared. And you're, initially all of that grief cycle of well, this isn't what I planned for. I don't know what to do here. I'm not prepared, doesn't allow the ability to see the beauty of Holland and the people of Holland and things to be appreciated about arriving in the place that you didn't expect. And ultimately, the poem kind of culminates in once you kind of lift that veil and you shed your expectations, you can kind of learn to view Holland in a different way and not necessarily in a negative way. And I think as parents, especially in the world we live in with all of our access to information and Google and resources, we always think that we're prepared. And life sometimes has a different plan in a lot of ways. And particularly if you are the parent of a child or adult that's neurodivergent, navigating and trying to kind of shift your lens to be able to see the beauty in the differences is really an important place to start in the journey. But it is a journey to get there. So our hope in kind of using this as a segue to this conversation is really to be able to use that lens and recognizing we have to meet parents where they're at in this journey to be able to really give tools to our clients, our children, and their families based upon where they're at in the journey.
Sure. I mean, for me, the poem was so poignant and really, and it's not just about child rearing and parenting, it's about life. Like when you have to pivot, do you crumble or do you rise to the occasion and figure it out and forge ahead? So you keep saying the word neurodivergent. Just give our listeners a definition. What exactly does that mean, neurodivergent?
Sure, there's a lot of different contexts that sort of become a buzzword, so to speak. So, in the kind of medical framework, neurodivergent is when anything structurally or neurologically that is considered different from the quote normal neurological functioning, both from a mental health, physical health, cognitive perspective. And then there's also kind of a social paradigm of neurodivergence, which is, any exhibition of social skills, social interaction, social communication that are different from what is considered the social norm.
So a parent has this diagnosis, neurodivergent. Now what? What do they do?
So, a parent who has a child who was recently diagnosed with a disability that might include autism, ADHD, learning disability, or a wide variety of disabilities would always benefit from talking to the pediatrician or primary care provider to pursue any additional therapy, such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, social worker counseling services that might help the child. Another great place to start would be contacting the child's school district. And so, if the child is identified through the education system, whether it's early intervention, so little children birth to 3 years old, or children who are in formal school starting in kindergarten on up, are able to go through the educational process to get an IEP to qualify for special education services.
I know that I had my second child received a whole bunch of early intervention services, and I was in New York at the time, and I had to contact our county directly. First, I don't even know if you know the answer to this, but does every state, is it required that they provide early intervention services?
Yeah, each state has its own eligibility criteria. So, in the state of Missouri, for example, you can be evaluated by the state if you're under 3, and you have to demonstrate a 50% delay in 2 areas of development. So, physical and communication, which is a quite stringent eligibility criteria and does miss a lot of children, particularly those neurodivergent children who have kind of subtle challenges, right? That are going to score maybe 25%. But every single state, Jana can speak to Illinois, has different eligibility criteria services.
Someone is given a diagnosis that their child is neurodivergent, whether it's autism on the spectrum, ADHD, whatever the diagnosis is. And they come to, let's start with Jill because you're with the younger children, and they come to Jill for services. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you work with the child and what support do you provide for the parents?
Yes, absolutely. So, in my specific example, I work with children on the autism spectrum, but have experience working with a variety of diagnoses. And from the outset, we try to establish caregiver empowerment from the first session. So, when we think about what our evidence based practices are to help support the child, that has to include the client and family values. So we always say what is important to you, and we are very collaborative in our goal and our goal writing. The approach that we use in our clinic is a strengths-based approach. So it is child-led in their natural environment. So if we're in the home, we're using the toys and the food and the things that they care about that are meaningful to them as guides for leveraging their goals and support rather than writing goals to help a child be more neurotypical, so to speak.
Do you ever run into a problem if parents aren't on the same page?
About the diagnosis or about the treatment recommendations?
Like, well, first of all, yes to both of those. Like, do the parents come in and say, no, this, I don't know, you're blowing this all out of proportion. They'll grow out of this. And one parent is, we need this, this, and this.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so typically those first few sessions end up being really rapport building, and buy-in is maybe kind of a funny term because it has nothing to do with the financial piece. But that's why we start right at the beginning. Parents are in session. They're a part of the treatment. And so for those, different adults learn differently. So even though my primary patient is a child, in pediatrics, your second patient is their family member because that's who's going to support the child. And so typically I try to determine how the caregiver learns best, right? So if it's someone who needs to sit and just observe, and I'm coaching through that way versus a parent who's on the floor with me, like showing you what they're doing, very hands-on. And a lot of times it's a little bit of, similar to the welcome to Holland. I'm meeting them where they're at. So if they're still, I'm thinking I'm in Italy and I haven't arrived in Holland yet, I'm having to recalibrate expectations of what are the goals for the caregiver? What are the goals for the child? And as long as it's really through a strengths-based lens and the goals can align with, okay, what does your eating routine look like? What community do you guys go to the park? If I'm able to say to the families, if this feels like you're doing therapy with your child, you're doing it wrong. You need to feel like you are communicating and engaging and interacting with your child like while you're changing their diaper. And if you feel like you're setting aside time to do this, then it's not natural. So trying to also not have caregivers feel like they're also their child's therapist, because during this transition of time, they end up becoming a case manager, right? For their child. I have to get you to this. I have to get you this. I have to get you to this. So from the outset, parent caregiver empowerment, because the last thing we want to happen is by the time they get to Jana, the parent gets to Jana and says, our early intervention speech therapist, Jill, held our hand all the way till we got to you. And now we don't know what to do. And we cut the umbilical cord at kindergarten and we're lost. So it's a balancing act because we do have the expertise, but they're the expert on their kid. So also telling them that you are an expert on Johnny. You tell me what he likes. That helps me do my job until he can tell me what he likes.
So, are part of the services for families, does that include therapy, right? Like communication based therapy, so both parents can discuss how this is going to work, how they're going to feel about it. Is one person taking the lead, or, there's a whole grieving process that comes, and, you got to work through that and give yourself time to grieve what you thought your child was going to be doing at X age. And now you're, somewhere different. So is that part of it? Or no, this is something additional that maybe you guys as speech pathologists recommends that they do, or you stay away from that?
Typically, if I'm working with a family and a lot of the counseling piece starts to occur and I feel like it's out of my scope in regards to either the parents aren't on the same page or there's multiple different caregivers and family members involved and grandma brings the child to therapy, but mom is at home, when there's a lot of different layers and I feel like I'm doing more of a systems management and I feel like I'm out of scope, then that's really when, as Jana mentioned before, that social worker piece can come into play to help be that support for even the alphabet soup that comes from a diagnosis. What is SLP? What is OT? What is ABA? Where, we do the education within our scope, but how do we have someone say, okay, you were diagnosed, they had you leave. Let's revisit this at 3 months and let's talk about, do you understand what this means? Do you feel like you can access community resources? And so that's when, for me, and I think Jana has a social worker on staff where we do that pivot because that is the only caregiver education therapeutic piece that's in our scope would be as it relates to the goals and home carryover.
Okay. So, Jana, you want to chime in? How critical, like, is it part of the program that every family should have a social worker to help them on this journey?
I think it's probably really helpful for most parents and families to, if that is something interesting for them that they think would help them as a family operate and learn to sort of navigate life with a child or adolescent with a disability. I think that is only going to be helpful to improve day to day family dynamics. And sort of as the child starts to get older and the needs, strengths, and challenges of the child change and evolve as the social and academic expectations continue to get harder, I think that that's helpful. You'll often see middle school time, some of the more social challenges of navigating groups of peers, being left out of situations, and helping to empower your child to find their people where they feel connected and safe to do that. And that might look different if they are neurodiverse. And a lot of the young adults that I work with have shared with me over the years that they feel more confident engaging one on one or in like smaller groups of people versus some people who are neurotypical might prefer like a larger group or they might not. And not everybody thrives in a large group. I prefer more one on one myself. I feel like it's much more comforting to be with a smaller group of people than a loud party, so to say.
All right. So, Jana, you work in a school system, correct? Okay. And what ages do you typically work with? Is it a large range?
So right now I work at a high school district in Illinois in the Chicago suburbs, and I am full time with our extended transition services students. And so students who qualify for extended transition services are between the ages of 18 and 22, and they all have an IEP for a disability that impacts them to achieve their post secondary goals. So think about independent living, employment, and education. So all of my students, we call them young adults because they are 18 to 22. They all have a variety of disabilities. I would say the most common that we currently have are students with intellectual disabilities, autism, ADHD, and then some as well that have learning disabilities.
All right. And what does that look like helping them learn to become more independent and what their life might look like? Is the goal for them to live independently or is it to go on to secondary education or be prepared for a job? Or is each case very different?
So, great question. Each one of the things I love most about working in my role right now is that it's all highly individualized. And so we have students here who are attending community college classes and only receive services 1 day a week, or we meet them out at the local community college and I help them learn about their accommodations, how to apply for them, how to create reminders in their Google Calendar, to turn in assignments, to break down a full semester assignment that's 100% of their grade. So they can chunk the assignment so that they are successful in their class. So I have students that are like that. And then we have the full range. So we have students who are with us 5 full days a week who their goal is not independent living. They will always have a supported living environment, whether that's at home or in a group home or what's called a SILA, which stands for Community Integrated Living Arrangement, where there's staff that come in and help support, whether it's full time or part time. And then we have students sort of in between who want to live with roommates and friends, and they might come together and have somebody hired to come help them with like laundry, check in, make sure that they're set up once a week or twice a week or whatever that looks like. And we have some students who have independent competitive employment and they work at a grocery store or a hardware store. And we have students who are helping support learn vocational skills to get a job one day.
It sounds amazing. Truly, it does what you're
So
doing.
it's really different.
The one group I didn't hear you mention though are the parents. Where are they in this process? And is really that your goal is to have them living independent, functioning independent of their parents? And then how do the parents receive that? Are they working towards the same goal for their child?
Yeah, no, totally. So it gets a little different when we think about extended transition services because the children are adults. So they are 18. And so some of our young adults have their own are their own guardians, and in which case they are the sole decision makers of their educational rights or medical, and there's guardianship in a lot of different areas. But we have students whose their parents are their guardian. And so I think the answer kind of depends on if you're talking about somebody who has their own guardianship. Parents are obviously a key part of the decision, but when we think about education, it's so much is focused on like the parents for so long, and then it sort of shifts and we put it back to the young adult on what are their goals for their future, and it doesn't always match what the parents' goals are for the child, and that can be a really hard dynamic to navigate.
So what do you do in those instances? Because that, I can imagine that is very difficult.
We are there for the student, and so it's a little different in the schools versus compared to what Jill was sharing privately or through early intervention. Obviously, we value immensely parent input and all of that. But at the end of the day, we want to help support our young adults to increase their confidence and advocacy to communicate to their parents, this is what I want for my future and have self determination over their lives. And that can be hard because oftentimes, I mean, we see it every day, their parents do not agree initially or want their child they see something else for their child's life. And I think that's hard regardless of if the young adult is neurotypical because you have a vision for your child's life as early as they are when they're 5 years old. I have a vision for my 5-year-old's life and she's going to grow up and it's either going to take it and run with it, and it's the same for our young adults, and so I think that it's such a transition age in general, the 18 to 22, where they're trying to figure out how to be independent, but they still might call parents all the time to ask how to cook a recipe or, like, how to do the laundry and make sure so it's a can be a challenging dynamic to navigate, but
Yeah, I'm sure it comes with a lot of fear, right? And or the role has been they've been so involved and even more so involved than a neurotypical child. And if they've had multiple children, they've been, I'm going to use a therapeutic word. I don't know if it's right for this situation, but enmeshed, right? Like their lives have been so running together that think, oh my God, like how are they gonna survive on their own without me? I think is more the parent's concern and issue than the child. I mean, than the young adult.
when I hear you say that, I think about, like, building resilience, and I think about how so many times we've had parents express that same sentiment and same feeling, and we try to sort of coach, like Jill shared earlier, and allow the parent to either let their child fail and use it as a learning opportunity, or to sit back and see their child be successful in something that they had no clue that they could do. And it's really cool. We do some sabotaging of our young adults to help them gain their skills. And so example, I
Talk to us about that.
Sabotaging of our young adults. I feel a future episode.
Isn't that just parenting?
what I mean, and I think you guys know what I mean, uh, is, and Jill, being on the early end, you do this too. It just looks different. You withhold a ball and you're like staring expectantly at the child at the ball, looking at them, waiting for them to ask for the ball.
Right. You want them to say the word ball. So
Or to
what
sign for it, or to use whatever means they have to communicate for it. And so on the flip end, for me, we're working with students on accessing public transportation. So we're right off a bus line, our public transportation, and so that was intentional. Our site, so our students can learn to navigate the Pace Bus, is what it's called by us. And so we have visuals, we have supports, we've done training. They've done it dozens and dozens of times. Then after 6, 8 months, we will send them out on their own. And it can be really scary. And we're sort of in the car in the back, kind of spying on them without them knowing. So they're set up for success, but we're pushing them a little bit. And they have all the resources. They have their phone numbers of our site where they can contact if there's an emergency. They just don't happen to know that we're watching them. And so we sabotage that, and then maybe the bus is running late, or maybe they missed the bus. And then they're standing there, and there's a group of 2 or 3 of them. They all have cell phones, they all have the numbers to do it. And it's like, okay, we wait. What are they going to do? And they come back. They're initially not very happy because it's cold out, and they were obviously very anxious and stressed about it. But they did all the right things. They called the front desk, they communicated where they were, they said, should we wait an hour for the next bus, or should we find another way home? And because the weather was kind of cold, we sent somebody out to get them in one of our vans. But the next time they felt so much more confident taking the bus, had because we sort of pushed them to a little bit outside of their comfort zone to be more confident navigating public transportation. And now these students can access all of our area. This was 2 years ago, and it's with a few of our students who are exiting this year. So they're all 21. So they now use the bus all the time.
That's amazing. I love that.
And also a perfect example of then being able to, at a parent meeting, use anecdotal stories or objective data to support what the process was to help support your students to be more independent and be able to say, these are, the problem solving strategies we've given. These are, those types of things where you can either advocate for that, or more importantly, the student can then advocate for how to problem solve through some of those safety related situations that may cause parents fear.
So, at what age, and I'm sure there's a range and depending on every child, but around what age or stage should a child of a neurodivergent, or no, a parent of a neurodivergent child start to have the child navigate for themselves?
And advocate. Navigate and advocate.
Oh, sorry. That's what I meant to say.
So, Jana and I actually had an interesting conversation about this because I think we all, as parents in general, view self advocacy as something that, first of all, requires verbal language skills. And second of all, that requires, being older, your ability to, speak your mind and have self determination and advocate for your needs. But truly, it can start as young as, 18 months, or when you start toddling around your world and starting to encounter situations of frustration. So we talk about, like, in the early intervention world, like a puzzle as an example. Before a child maybe even has words, how do we teach them to advocate that they're feeling frustrated and they need help and they need support in their little world, where the puzzle is the most important thing that they're problem solving, not a bus route? And how do we teach in that moment before they can say, hey, I need help, this is hard? How do we teach them to gain our attention nonverbally, or use a sign for help, or a communication device, or a visual if they're a child that is not verbally communicating yet? So we can start that young with teaching, okay, you're encountering something that's hard. How can we give you a strategy, whether it's visual, whether it's an alternative way to communicate, whether it's a gesture, where you're encountering a difficult situation where you need support and you need different ways to problem solve. So I don't think there's not necessarily a prerequisite, so to speak, for starting to teach it. Over time, when a child kind of evolves into having a more stable way to communicate, which does not have to be verbal, we can elaborate on what that looks like as what becomes moments requiring self-advocacy shift and change. So I think of a child maybe with a hearing loss as a complete pivot who, as they get older, learning to self-advocate if they're having a hard time hearing, being able to approach an adult and say, hey, I think something's going on with my hearing aid. I can't hear out of this ear. That those type of goals that are explicitly written to help with repairing communication, asking people to repeat, asking people for support, and having goals as the child gets older be explicitly written for self-advocacy, rather than when we're just building these foundational steps of understanding that ways to identify support. And then it expands in Jana's world in terms of self-advocacy groups and self-advocacy goals, if you want to talk about that.
I totally hear what you're saying and remember working with the littles, and it continues to evolve as the child gets older. And I will share, essentially every single one of our students has a self-advocacy goal. It just might look a little bit different as they get older. So some examples are supports and tools that have helped a child from the time when they're in kindergarten. Likely that child, as they grow up, have the same tools and strategies that have been proven to be successful for them. They also grow up to have to sorry, this is like, let me count it. We have young adults who their advocacy goals focus on having an understanding of their disability. And once our young adults have an understanding of what their disability is and how it might impact them, both in positive ways and ways that require more support, they are better able to have an understanding of what they might need to advocate for. So we have students who have visual checklists to help them remember what groceries they need to go to the grocery store. And so you might see an example of a self advocacy goal for one of my students is will determine a helpful tool and advocate for it.
All right. And so are they advocating for themselves like with their parents or with their teacher? Like, all right, I like this tool. I think I should have this tool. Can I get this tool to help me in the
It sounds it should be with whoever is they're interacting with in their world, but and here's the thing, that's not any different than we want for our newer neurotypical kids. We want to raise kids who are self-advocating for themselves at every age. Just the steps it takes to get there might look a little different for a child who is neuro versus neurotypical. But it's our as parents, it's our goal for all of our kids.
100%.
And we think about how all of us have different strengths and challenges, and all of us learn differently and think differently. And it's the same no matter what. And so we all have different tools that we use. Like I thrive off of a calendar. I could not function without my calendar. And that is a tool to help support my executive functioning in the same way that it is for a child or adult who is neurodiverse, right? And so it's the same tool, and these tools can be helpful no matter what.
Across the board for everybody.
And Jana, you also made me think of with like the grocery list and how we find these tools that can grow with the individual. Okay, before you can maybe read and write, you might have a visual of all the foods you need on your grocery list. And then over time, if you gain reading or writing or typing or whatever type of method of additional communication as you go through schooling, then you might type your list or write your list. The same way I can't go to the grocery store without a list. And so when we support these foundational tools, Jana's absolutely right. It's what is a tool that then can grow and we can build off of And a lot of times you have to try a bunch of tools and figure out what works. And a grocery list works for me, it might not work for somebody else. And
I probably need the grocery list because I end up there like 3 days in a row instead of
That's where I've been at the last few days.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. One thing we didn't address yet that I want to make sure we talk about is how important is it to share with your child as a parent, that a parent shares with their child their diagnosis?
Wait, can I just step in here for a second because I just wanna share my quick story? So, one of my children at the age of 3 had a diagnosis of mild speech apraxia, and for me, I was kind of blindsided by the diagnosis. I knew he was speech delayed, I knew he needed OT and PT, but to hear a diagnosis like that without any explanation of what that would look like for him as he grew. So I went home, I did my own research. I found out it could lead to reading comprehension delays. He might not be able to play sports. So I called my speech pathologist in a tizzy and I said, "You didn't tell me any of this." And she's like, "Okay, so what? So he won't be able to play baseball." And I said, "What? I can't tell my husband he might not be able to play baseball." And it's just an example of having to pivot. So my son ended up in 3rd grade. That was when I saw the apraxia creep in to his reading comprehension because this kid taught himself to read in kindergarten by rote memory and the videos. Remember those leapfrog videos where they say, "Where are the vowels? Where are the glue?" And he taught himself to read by watching these videos and putting the words together, but he didn't have the comprehension piece. So we had to go out and get, and the school, because he tested high on his IQ, but still had these deficits in his comprehension, they weren't willing to help because his grades didn't support the fact that he was struggling. But as his parent and as his advocate at the time, I knew he was. So he went and he needed specific strategies to teach him how to read. And once he got it, I'm sorry, how to understand what he was reading. And once he got those strategies, he never looked back. Same with sports. Once literally you could see his wheels turning, you could see him practicing over and over again until it became second nature to him. And he went on to play high school baseball, which wasn't incredible in itself. But one day we're driving in the car and probably middle school age, I mentioned to him that he had a diagnosis of mild speech apraxia, and I had never told him before, and he was so upset with me. He said, "It explains so much. It explains why big words give me a hard time. It explains why I have a hard time with understanding and why I read so slow." He said, "Why didn't you ever share this with me? I thought something was wrong with me." And I said to him, I took a step back because all this time, those were the exact reasons I didn't tell him, because I didn't want him to have limits and I wanted him to figure it out. And so I don't know if what I did was right or wrong. At like so many things we do as a parent, we question every decision we make. And that into Carrie's question, is there a right or wrong in sharing a diagnosis with your child?
What an amazing story to hear all about your son and that he's played high school baseball. I love that.
He's exceeded every expectation that we ever had for him, academically as well.
There is not a time that's too early or too late. So if you are on the fence of having a challenging conversation with your child, just know that a lot of the young adults that I've worked with over the years, all of the ones who were informed and told about their disabilities early on, where they felt a better understanding of their strengths and their challenges and their identity, it became more a part of their identity early on. So the students that I have that were told maybe in like early elementary school feel more connected to like the culture around their disability compared to the ones who might have not been told until they were maybe close to 18, have historically, in my experience at least, have had a harder time sort of accepting that and they don't necessarily feel that same sense of community around disability. And something that we do so much in my work is building that community around disability, because people still think it's a negative word and can be taboo to talk about. But it's not a bad thing. It's a part of your identity in the same way that any part of your identity is. And so I don't think that there's a time that's too early or too late. And your child will sort of lead you to when the right time will be. They might start asking questions about it, about maybe comparing themselves to peers or talking about tasks that are hard, and maybe in their roundabout way asking why they're hard, or if they have a sibling, specifically one that's older, or twins. Jill has twins, and so the dynamic of multiples too, I think, can be a challenging one to navigate as it relates to this, specifically if one twin is neurotypical and one is neurodivergent. So any situation in a house where there's a comparison, so to say, I think that the child will lead you there maybe a little bit earlier than if they are the oldest or if they don't have a sibling at home.
All right. So the message in general is like, as parents, let your child lead you there, but don't be afraid to go there.
Yeah.
I think you raise a really important point there also, that it's not just the parents, it's the family. It's if there are other siblings, and specifically a child who is a set of multiples, if one is functioning at a different level. I think those are some really great conversations to have as a family, and some great learning points from them.
Yes, and how to tie in the self-advocacy empowerment piece to saying, "Hey, if you have a better sense of the areas that maybe are a little bit more challenging for you, these are the times to advocate," and kind of have them have a better understanding rather than feeling isolated, or the kind of why is this harder for me and not my sibling, or why not my classmates? Why do I have to get taken out for speech therapy while everyone's at PE?
It's a great lesson in empathy and compassion for a sibling that might be neurotypical.
In my experience as well, the child most often already knows that there are things that are going on. And by avoiding the topic as a parent, it might make the child feel that there's something wrong with them. And the older they get, it might be harder to sort of build and instill that confidence around the strengths that the child does have. And I think it can be a really hard but really powerful conversation to have with your child.
I could not agree more. And I think that's a great way to wrap up our discussion here. Do you ladies have any last piece of, if you had to give one piece of advice or one something that stuck out for you to share with parents, is there anything you would want them to know?
I think from when we speak from the whole the lifespan we've talked about today, I think we both are like, it's never too early and it's never too late to kind of, embrace neurodivergence, determine what it looks like for you and your family, and empower yourself with community and support that align with the life that you hope for your child, and that your child, more importantly, hopes for themselves.
Perfect. Thank you. Jana?
Jill took what I was going to say.
You could say ditto.
Yeah.
To add to it, what I would say is I would just say trust your child and sort of the process, and let your child lead you to where they want to go, and give your child opportunities to fail and to learn to build resilience, and so they have the skills they need to fly and to flourish. And I think it can be really helpful to just pause and wait and see, am I overstepping in an attempt to try and help my child learn this specific skill? Or if I take a step back and think big picture, if I let them struggle a little bit, the benefits and power of a productive struggle on a child's confidence.
And finally, neurodivergence is just a variation in humanity. It's not a pathology. It's not something that needs to be fixed. It's just a variation in what's normal. And heck, who knows what's normal these days?
There are so many versions of it, Jill, pointing that out to us and to our listeners. I really appreciate you both being with us today. Carrie, any last words?
No, I just want to say the best, if anyone listening would like to reach out to Jill or Jana, we will provide their contact information in our show notes. Are you ladies, would you prefer email, phone numbers, what's your best contact email to get
Yep,
to reach
we
you
can do
guys?
email, and then we will also send some resources as well that people can access.
All right. Thank you, ladies, for your time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Parent Coaches Unleashed with Carrie and Jessica. Together, we can raise the next generation of independent, capable, and compassionate young adults.
We encourage you to send us an email with questions and feedback to info@parentcoachesunleashed.com. Please remember, you are not alone on this parenting journey.